Okay, so no takers at the moment on Zoom, so I'm going to talk directly to this camera. Yeah, so today I'm going to talk about chapter 14 of my book, Delivering the Impossible. And chapter 14, the name it's got at the moment is The Car. And that's because what I try and do in chapter 14 is talk about empirical process and explain what empirical process is by talking about driving a car. Now, I know that empirical process is a difficult concept to explain, possibly because that word empirical is an unusual word that people haven't heard before, and it's not really easy to explain kind of how it derives. But the word how do I know that it's a difficult concept to explain? Because in one course that I taught once, in the feedback afterwards, when I asked people what is the most important thing that you've learned from the course, somebody said the value of imperial progress. So yes, it's a difficult concept, but maybe a lot of that difficulty is just to do with the word, because really what we're talking about is something very straightforward and also kind of like, I would say, very dear to the kind of people who value common sense. So when we're talking about empirical process, we talk about three pillars of empirical process. And those are transparency, inspection, and adaptation. So what is transparency? So transparency is the ability to see what's going on, the ability to understand what's going on in your environment. And if you were driving a car, you would understand that this is very important. Yes, you need to be able to see out of your windscreen. You need to be able to see what's going on through your rear view mirror and your side mirrors. You need to see what's going on around you. If you've got a windscreen that's covered in frost or mud or snow, or it's raining so hard that you can't see through it, this is a really big problem with driving, that you have great difficulty if you can't see, if you don't have transparency. So that's the first most important thing about an empirical process. The second most important thing about an empirical process is you need inspection. So it's not enough to be able to see out of the windows in a car. You have to actually look as well. You have to actually pay attention. You have to actually look at what's going on around you. And this is kind of how you actually become aware. You build a model of the world by looking at it. So it's not enough. If you're looking down at your phone all the way through your driving experience, you're probably going to have some problems. So this is the kind of second pillar of empirical process, is that you need to not only be able to see what you have transparency, but you actually need to look as well. And then the final thing is adaptation. So you really need to be able to see what's going on outside in the world. You really need to actually look and see what's going on outside in the world. And then the final aspect of this is that you need to modify what you do. You need to speed up, slow down, turn left, turn right. All of the things that you can do when you're driving a car in light of what you see, outside the window, through the windscreens, through the mirrors, etc. So these are the three pillars of the empirical process. And as I said, the word empirical is very kind of peculiar to a lot of people, but these things I'm talking about, transparency, being able to see through the windscreen, inspection, actually looking through the windscreen, and then adaptation, changing what you do in light of what you see, these aren't weird concepts. These are extremely straightforward concepts. Now, what do these have to do with software development, and especially agile software development? Well, the things that are recommended as approaches, for example, in the Scrum approach to agile, I would say all of these things, they're working. So kind of this is the meetings that are suggested for agile and Scrum. All of these meetings are increasing or supporting one of these three pillars of the empirical process. So, for example, if you have a daily stand-up, what you're doing in that daily stand-up is you're doing all of these three things. If people are actually telling you what's going on in the stand-up, right? So if the team are actually kind of talking about what they've done and what they're going to do and what's stopping them, this is transparency, but it's also inspection if everybody else is actually paying attention to what they're saying. And also, it's adaptation. So if in light of what people are saying in that meeting, things need to change. So if somebody's uncovered a problem, which means that other people need to change what they're doing because it's such a serious problem, this is adaptation. You can change what you're doing in light of what emerges in the stand-up. Same with planning. One of the ways that you can do planning is that you can plan in terms of what's called yesterday's weather. So you can plan the amount of work that you're going to do for the next typically 2 weeks in light of how much work you got through in the previous 2 weeks. Another thing that you can do in that meeting is that you can plan different work from what had been imagined or discussed previous to that meeting in light of new things that have come to light. So you can adapt, you can make a change in what you're going to work on in light of new things that have come to light. So let's say there's a change in priority or there's some emergency that needs addressing. You can change what is being done in the planning meeting as a result of those discussions. So planning is kind of pretty much focused on adaptation, but it also has these aspects of transparency and inspection as well. How do we do in the previous sprint? We'll use that to inform what we're going to do in this sprint. Retrospectives again, facilitating all three of those aspects of Agile. So retrospectives are providing transparency, letting the team express what's going on, talk to each other about how they're feeling about how things are going on. So that's kind of definitely transparency. Again, inspection, letting everybody hear what other people are thinking and what their experiences are. And again, adaptation. So in light of kind of this look back at how things have been going, what are we going to do differently? How are we going to change what we do in light of what we've discussed in this retrospective? And then finally, we have show and tell, or sprint demo, or all the other names that there are for it, which is this meeting where you demonstrate working software. Now, this is extremely important in terms of transparency because it shows people in the wider organization what is actually going on in the project, what is actually being done, like demonstrating working software. So that's extremely important. It's also really important that you encourage inspection so that you encourage people to come along to the show and tell. Maybe they're not central stakeholders, maybe they're peripheral stakeholders, but it's still extremely useful to have those people to come along to show and tells. And in terms of adaptation, well, when you actually demonstrate working software in show and tell meetings, then you can get feedback. This is the crucial thing that you can get from a show and tell. You can get feedback from stakeholders, possibly feedback from users as well. You might actually be able to do show and tells to users, and that feedback might change what you do in future sprints. And if it is changing what you're doing in future sprints, then that is adaptation. So this metaphor of driving the car is relatively useful. And one of the things that you can think of, the role of a Scrum Master or a Agile Project Manager or whatever you want to call it in a project, is making sure that these things are facilitated and that they actually happen, that there is inspection, that people actually pay attention to what's going on around them, that there is transparency, that people are allowed to say what's going on, they're allowed to communicate what's going on, and they do communicate what's going on. And also there is adaptation. So in light of new things that we discover, we can change direction, we can do different things. And so that is the fundamental aspect of empirical process. And what is the opposite of empirical process? Well, the opposite of empirical process is theoretical process, whereas basically, and this is how software development projects used to work before Agile came along, which was there was a detailed description that was kind of created over a long period of time, which was the specification of the project. And then that detailed description was implemented. And very often in that process, there was no transparency. So there was no showing what actual progress was. There was no discussion of any problems that were encountered as this kind of development went along. And there was no inspection. The people, the stakeholders who were connected to this project didn't look to see what was going on in this kind of long period after the requirements have been put together and before the expected release of this software some months or years later. So there was none of those three things: the inspection, adaptation, and transparency. And as a result, a lot of these projects really failed. So from the point of view of my book, the crucial thing to understand here is that this empirical process, I find myself in virtually every chapter of my book talking about empirical process and talking about how important it is to actually go back to experience. And when I was talking about the strangeness of the word empirical, it actually comes, I know a little bit of Greek, I struggle with modern Greek, but the Greek word for experience is eberia. And that's where the word empirical comes from. It comes from experience. And so when we're talking about an empirical process, we're not talking about anything strange or wacky. We're talking about a very, very practical suggestion, which is we should modify what we do in light of what we find as we move through a project. And we should look and see what's going on so that we can modify what we do. Now, why might anybody have a problem with that? The reason that people sometimes have a problem with that is because there is this idea, and I talk about this in the book, of projects being a process of keeping a promise. So the idea is that there was an initial statement of the requirements, and the purpose of the project is to honour that initial statement of requirements. There are also some other reasons why this might cause problems by actually relying on what you can see around you and experience might cause problems. That the idea itself may have been initially very attractive and compelling and got a lot of support from senior people. But once we start to actually look around us as we're driving along and notice problems and modify what we do in light of those problems, then the idea is shown to be in some ways problematic. And because the idea is shown to be in some ways problematic, the people who supported it, the people who garnered support for it, the people whose name is associated with it, they also start to have problems. So although it sounds like an extremely straightforward, common sense idea that we should pay attention to what's going on in front of us and we should modify what we're doing accordingly, it is important to bear in mind that in any project, in my experience, in any project, there will be pressures, there will be people, there will be situations in which your team is being discouraged from working in an empirical way and is being encouraged to not report problems. There will be situations where one of the chapters I talk about commitment and consistency, which is this idea of projects as keeping promises. There will be situations in which people will try and make you feel bad. They will try and put you on the back foot. They will call you names because you've not kept a promise. But it's very difficult to keep a promise and at the same time deal with some of the things that you encounter in projects from an empirical point of view. So, to come back to the car example, you might have promised somebody that you're going to be at a party by a certain time, but if you're driving along and any of the kind of disasters that can happen on a road happen. There's a massive pile up in front of you, there's an earthquake, there's a flock of sheep, maybe all three. You have to deal with what's in front of you. You have to modify your behavior in light of what you actually find when you're driving. If you don't modify your behavior in light of what you actually find when you're driving, you're going to cause catastrophe, and that would be a crazy thing to do. But it's amazing how often, when talking about software development and projects, because you can't actually see the things physically, that's one of the great values of show and tells, is like actually showing working software, that you will hear senior people suggest exactly that we ignore all the problems that we've encountered, that we don't modify our behavior in light of the problems that we've encountered. And your project is never going to succeed unless you do this thing, unless you honor empirical process through fostering transparency, inspection, and adaptation.